Yeah, I'm excited to present you all today, this afternoon, about woodland restoration from forest to front yards. So, start off, I wanted to show you all this picture. Chris gave me a brief introduction. I want to see a little bit of where you all are as far as your restoration knowledge. So, if you all can take a look at this picture and just in the chat, note a couple of things that you notice. Just spend a brief moment here, see if we can get some responses. Yes, we got some honeysuckle removal. It's in DuPage County, that's correct. Lots of honeysuckle removal, that's right. So moving to this next image here, what do you all notice about the differences between these two? Lots of native plants, wildflowers, native flowers, pollinators. Awesome. Thank you all for the responses, and I appreciate that. Yeah, so here's just another quick introduction about myself. This is my first webinar series talk that I'm giving, so I'm really excited again to be here discussing this with you all today. I'm an extension specialist in forestry. I have a background in ecological inventory and restoration, but also arboriculture and urban forestry with certifications from the ISA and Society of Ecological Restoration. I'm a native plant enthusiast, and my favorite tree is a bur oak. So just like our initial prompt, here is a bur oak that I've actually got planted in my yard. So I'm really excited to discuss these topics with you all today. And for today's presentation, I'm going to begin with a brief, a, a broad overview of ecological restoration, what it is, what are some concepts that are important to it, and then I'm going to get into more specifics and discuss some tools and techniques that we might be able to use when we're thinking about restoring woodlands, specifically in our natural areas, but also in more urban areas in places like our yards. So what is ecological restoration? I've got two definitions here, and I think they give a broad explanation of what it is. First is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And second, its aims to recreate, initiate, accelerate the recovery of an ecosystem that has been unnaturally disturbed. And I added in unnaturally there because there are natural disturbances that are important for many of our ecosystems, and we're going to discuss some of those today as well. But I think this broad concept kind of gives us an idea, and some things to note in both of these definitions are it's a process, and we're assisting. It's not necessarily an end goal. Again, ecological restoration, it's a process and it's relative to a starting point. So it can include some other concepts that you may have heard of, such as remediation or habitat enhancement. Remediation might be something like improving or creating a new ecosystem or improving a system from a degraded state. And when we're thinking about habitat enhancement, we might have what we might already consider a forest, but we want to improve the quality of that forest to increase biodiversity and support other species that we may not have been supporting otherwise. So here's a logic model that I created, kind of explaining this process of ecological restoration. And what this model really enforces is that ecological restoration is an iterative process, meaning that it's not just a single step that we need to take or a single effort, but it's a combination of efforts over time, kind of moving towards what we would consider a restored ecosystem. So uh, the steps of this iterative process, the few first steps we might not need to perform throughout every single iteration. There might just be steps that we look at initially, and we might revisit them later, but we might not. So we might begin with taking a baseline inventory that's getting some, just basic data about and information about the system that we're starting in. We might then identify a reference, assess the stressors that are on the system, and then move into establishing goals and objectives and creating a management plan, and then carrying out that plan. But then later on, reassessing and reevaluating. And these are all steps that I'm going to discuss further throughout this presentation. So I also wanted to emphasize that uh, ecological restoration is really a multifaceted discipline. And this is one of the reasons why it's really most interesting to me because it incorporates so many other fields of study and knowledge areas into this science that we can call ecological restoration. You need a strong background in everything from natural history and forestry and hydrology all the way over to landscape design is another really important aspect of this that especially in urban areas, and we're going to discuss a little bit more about that later. So when I'm talking about ecological restoration, how might that differ from traditional forestry or forest management that we often discuss a lot here at Illinois Extension Forestry? And this Venn diagram kind of shows some of the ways that it's similar, but also some ways that it might be different. And, forest management and ecological restoration, I think really especially in recent years, are kind of starting to overlap more and more. And so just because, this Venn diagram excludes things doesn't mean that's always the case or not. But, both fields really have a focus on improving forest health. They include, cultural activities that we might partake in on the landscape, things like hunting or recreational activities. Those can both be part of restoration or forest management. They include a variety of tools, many of which are very similar and inform one another, and they emphasize the long-term sustainability of the system. The areas where they might differ include maybe more of a focus on a holistic ecosystem and understory management that we might not necessarily think about as much in traditional forestry, but that's really important for ecological restoration. And ecological restoration, one big difference as well is this important monitoring component, which, monitoring is also important in traditional forestry, but maybe not necessarily as heavily emphasized. So now that we've discussed a little bit about what ecological restoration is, the question arises, well, when do we consider an ecosystem to be restored necessarily? And there are several different factors that we can look at to judge whether or not an ecosystem is restored. These are some good examples that are provided by the Society of Ecological Restoration, including um, the resemblance that you can achieve compared to your native reference ecosystem. And reference ecosystem is something I'm going to discuss a lot more on the next few slides. You have a physical environment that sustains the species that of interest that you have. You have a system that functions normally for the stage that it is in. It's part of a larger landscape context with minimized threats, and it's resilient to natural stressors and disturbances, which are some things uh, that we might actually want to incorporate in our ecosystem restoration projects. And then it's self-sustaining for the level of the reference ecosystem that will choose moving forward. So in some cases, ecological restoration might have very specific requirements. If you think about um, like the context of wetland mitigation banking, you have predetermined requirements that are set by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and you might have very specific, maybe floral floristic quality requirements and or hydrology requirements that you need to meet to be able to consider that ecosystem restored for the purpose of a wetland mitigation project. But often, not all of us are working on, these very legally enforceable and uh, specific requirements like wetland mitigations. Often the assessment of whether or not an ecosystem is restored is a lot more subjective, and it's really a gradient. So this figure on the right kind of shows what we might consider different parts of that ecological restoration gradient, starting from a reduction of impacts and then moving towards rehabilitation and eventually ecological restoration. So to have a restored ecosystem, is the goal maybe per se, but this process of ecological restoration can take uh, can be implemented at any part of this gradient. And often it's up to the stakeholders. So, maybe it's us as the land managers or the people performing the restoration, but also, other people who might have a stake in that community or potentially financial incentives into that project. Maybe you received funding from a specific entity that you need to meet the requirements of. So now we've discussed a little bit about what ecological restoration is and when an ecosystem is restored. We can start to get into more specifically how this applies to woodlands and really what are woodlands anyway, and what defines a woodland versus a savanna or a forest. And really, that definition is comes down to the amount of canopy cover that you have within that system. So in Illinois, we have savannas, woodlands, and forests. And a savanna might range from 10 to 50% canopy cover. A woodland might be 50 to 80%, and a forest is really more of a closed canopy system with 80 to 100%. And so my presentation today, in the title I had woodlands, but really I'll be discussing kind of aspects that address to all three of these different types of systems. So here are some examples of real savannas, woodlands, and forests across Illinois. So why are we interested in restoring woodlands specifically? Well, historically, there would have been much more of a patchwork of woodlands present across the landscape than we have today. And a lot of those woodlands may have been converted for row crop agriculture or used simply for their forest resources. So historically, there would have been a lot more woodlands. But in addition to that, woodlands provide really important ecosystem services, including wildlife support and pollinator habitat. They provide services that help us mitigate and adapt to climate change, including carbon sequestration and temperature reductions. And they also help purify our air and water resources and provide recreational and cultural enrichment opportunities. Also, this presentation also pertains to urban systems. So I wanted to discuss briefly this concept of the urban forest and how it kind of fits into this restoration context. So the urban forest is really the ecosystem within any urban setting comprised of all the trees within that urban area, but also the green infrastructure and landscaping and other components of that ecosystem aside from those trees as well. And so when we talk about the urban forest, we're really talking about managing these urban trees and urban landscape features, green infrastructure, in a way as a system instead of as only their individual parts. So just like in ecosystem restoration, when we're thinking about this broad system and how we can benefit it overall, in urban forestry, we might think about, how all these parts interact with each other and how they can benefit one another. So what are some of the threats to woodlands, that we face in the modern day? We still have a lot of land use change, maybe not necessarily in Illinois, but across the globe, there's a lot of deforestation that still happens. There's habitat fragmentation, which is definitely still a problem in Illinois. We have new developments which are moving into these previously forested areas, and even if they maintain a lot of the forest canopy, they can still, put in roadways and other features that might increase fragmentation. We definitely have pests and diseases, things like um, emerald ash borer is still really prevalent across the landscape, and we need to think about how to address that. We have invasive species, something we discuss a lot here at Extension Forestry. Increased browse pressure is a really big problem with, increased deer populations. We have altered disturbance regimes with historic fire suppression, and then this concept of mesification, which is uh, increasingly wet and shady forested systems, which are excluding a lot of our species that are less shade tolerant and more adapted to fire. So where can we look to think about restoring woodlands? And um, the first place to look really is where we might have historically had wooded areas, but may have been deforested or you know potentially converted to another use for some reason. And there's a lot of useful information out there where we can look at previously forested areas in the state this land cover map from the early 1800s is really produced by the Illinois Natural History Survey is really useful in thinking about, previously wooded areas, and it helps show where a lot of maybe savanna and open oak woods may have existed before early colonization. And so this specific map is based off of very early survey data, which is also potentially available to be found and referenced. There's also aerial photographs that we can look at. They don't go quite back as far as this early survey data, but all of these sources are really important, and there's a wealth of geospatial data in places like the Illinois Geospatial Data Clearinghouse that we can look at for previous land use and start to think about areas that we might want to restore. But the reality of it is, if we are thinking about a restoration project, we probably already have an area in mind, and usually that's, an area that we might manage or an area maybe in our yard. And so there's definitely other possibilities for restoration in those types of areas as well. These might be degraded areas. Maybe it was an area that the disturbance regime was altered. Maybe it had fire suppression, or it was cultivated, harvested, or maybe wind thrown, even if we had a forested system that was really devastated by a tornado or other large wind event. We can also think about areas that were previously unwooded. So this concept of afforestation is definitely still something we discussed in ecological restoration. Uh, and it might be that forests are more applicable in certain areas now than they may have been previously due to things like changes in climate suitability, or potentially, you know, the value that we have for wooded systems might be especially important in urban areas because of those climate adaptation properties that they hold, including temperature reductions and air and water purification. And so we uh, we now get to this concept of hybrid restorations in these urban areas, which really refer to, not necessarily the classic kind of natural setting we would think of restoring, but these areas like this image on the right, which are really highly designed and serve a restoration purpose, but also uh, fit nicely into our urban systems and are still usable for other recreational type purposes and enjoyment. So, along with that hybrid restoration idea is this concept of novel ecosystems. And novel ecosystems, they might exist in urban settings, and I would argue that probably most urban restorations are going to be a novel ecosystem because they incorporate components that we may not necessarily have in natural settings. But that is not to say that natural type of restoration projects cannot also be considered novel. It might be that differences in climate or soil composition, or some remnants of previous disturbance. Maybe it's heavy metals that are now in the landscape, or differences in mycorrhizal fungi communities. A lot of these things contribute to a system which is going to be new and has never necessarily existed in the past. And so these new systems that we create through restoration, they might have species that are not normally found in nature alongside one another, but do well in our restoration systems. So just because a system is novel doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a valid restoration project. Kind of in contrast to this novel ecosystem idea is the idea of a restoration reference. And what we're looking at here is really a historic example of a community or an ecosystem that we have in our minds as a target for what we want to restore our systems to. And so these are normally high quality natural areas. They're often remnant sites that have been excluded from major human disturbances, and they're pretty rare across the landscape. So it can take some time to find a good restoration reference. And a lot of the rest of this presentation will kind of cover how to do that and certain other topics that we need to consider. When we think about a restoration reference, one useful aspect to consider is this idea of a coefficient of conservatism. And this is a value assigned to all species in all native species within within the state of Illinois. Um, that essentially describes the how conservative or not the species is. So, zero would describe a very weedy species, a non-conservative species, and 10 would be the most conservative. These might include things like orchids and other species. But this is a useful concept um, because it helps us think about, when we're looking at reference sites, if we're finding those high C value species, then we probably are looking in what might be a good reference system. So I guess when you're looking for a reference system, you want to be looking for those high C values, and then associated with those C values, we have this concept of floristic quality index, which is a single number that describes the overall floristic quality of the site based on calculations, including how many native species there are, and also these C values. And so if we're looking at, depending on which restoration kind of system we want to conduct, you might look at things like what oak species are there. For example, bur oak is actually one of the less conservative of the oak species, whereas chinkapin oak has a C value of an 8, so it's relatively a more conservative species. And if we're looking at reference systems and we find an area with chinkapin oak, that might, that's one thing that we can consider to help us identify a high quality reference system. But that's just one aspect, and we also need to consider, what type of system we're working in, because bur oak and chinkapin don't always necessarily occur in the same settings. But it's still a good starting point. And so we can't really continue to talk about restoration activities and historic these remnant systems without acknowledging the historic management activities that were performed by a lot of Native American folks on the landscape pre-settlement. And a lot of those activities included things like burning prairies and savannas to open the canopy and improve hunting quality, facilitate travel. They also definitely cultivated useful plants within these systems, including edible plants like wild onion, medicinal plants, and plants that they may have used for tools and other building materials. And so we definitely need to acknowledge the presence on the land of these native peoples on the landscape and their part in managing what we might consider a reference system. So where can I begin to look for references for my restoration project? Well, one good starting point is the Illinois natural divisions. And so there are 14 natural divisions across the state. These are determined by factors including topography, glacial history, bedrock, soils, and then the flora and fauna. And a map like this showing these natural divisions might be a good starting point just to get an idea of which areas generally you might think about looking in. So I'm located in Champaign-Urbana, and here's Champaign County, and I see that this is part of the Grand Prairie Natural Division. And so the Grand Prairie Natural Division actually stretches across a huge portion of the state of Illinois. And that helps me think about, when I'm looking at natural areas I might use for a reference, I might start just by looking in other counties within this Grand Prairie Natural Division and then go from there. But of course, these are very broad natural divisions, and they don't necessarily describe the conditions of your specific site. So it's just a starting point of places where to look. Once we've identified, which natural division we're in, we might think about looking for those high quality sites. And one great resource for identifying those high quality sites is the Illinois Nature Preserve System. And this is a system of high quality natural areas that have legal protection under Illinois state law. And it includes some of our highest quality natural areas that are both on public and private lands. So things like oak savannas, dolomite prairies, bogs, and fens. These are all great candidates for the Illinois Nature Preserve, and the Nature Preserve protects a lot of these areas. And so if you can find some of these areas in the landscape, they might serve as good reference ecosystems within your natural division. Another great resource is this Illinois Natural Areas Inventory. which was started in 1978. And this is basically a program that was used to identify and document all of Illinois' natural areas. So even more broadly than just the nature preserve system, this database includes all natural areas um, and it also includes grades based on quality. So if you can gain access to some of the data of this natural areas inventory, you might be able to also identify some of those areas even more broadly than just the nature preserves. There's also the Illinois Critical Trends Assessment Program. So all this data may not be public, but this program also has kind of served as a continuation of the natural areas inventory, but really looked at monitoring the changes over a course of about 25 years in over 600 sites within the state. And so this is performed by the Illinois Natural History Survey. And if you're interested in performing long-term kind of studies on some of these sites, this might be a good resource for you as well. So thinking about the forest types in Illinois, we have several different types of forests, but the most predominant forest type, and probably most important for many of our ecological systems, is the oak hickory forest type, which currently covers about 68% of the total forest area in Illinois, which is over 3 million acres. And so generally, this is going to be what I'm talking about as far as a restoration context for the most part. But there are also other systems, including beech maple, maple basswood, and western metaphysic. And in the very southern tip of the state, we have the cypress tupelo oak systems as well. So these are all potential forest systems. And if you're in one of those areas where a different forest type is more prevalent, then you might look at some of these other natural areas that have these forest types as an ecological reference. So why am I specifically interested in oaks and um, as opposed to many of these other species? Well, oaks are one of the most diverse tree groups within the state. There are 21 species of oaks, but also they serve as a keystone species um, that provide food and habitat for many different other organisms, including over 1,000 insects species that either use oaks for food or habitat. And then those insects in turn support other birds and wildlife. They're also a hard mast species, which means that they produce acorns, which is a nut crop, which is also very useful to squirrels, jays, turkeys, and deer, and among other wildlife. And they're relatively vulnerable to many of the modern stressors, including climate stressors and disturbance that we might experience in many systems. So again, oaks support over 700 species of Lepidoptera, many of which feed on the leaves of those oak trees and the leaves as well as the acorns. And this is more than any other native tree or plant. And there are also over 100 bird species that then consume these different Lepidopteran species. And so Lepidopteran are moths and butterflies. But there are also over 400 species of cynipid wasps, and many of those are these wasps that create galls and things on our oak trees. And so those galls are actually an important life stage of these wasps. And you are actually seeing a very unique organism here if you ever find these on your oak trees. As I mentioned, there are over 21 species of oaks, and along with that, there's also a wide gradient of different habitats that they occupy. And so here on the um, right side, I have some examples of oaks within the red oak group and oaks within the white oak group on the left. And they have this really wide range of tolerances as far as dry to wet habitats. And so in just about any restoration project that you'd imagine, there's probably an oak that is well suited for your site conditions. So now that we've discussed a lot of the aspects of what ecological restoration is and how we can start to think about it, where do we actually get started in this process? So these images kind of represent maybe a scene that many of you are familiar with if you are either working on a natural area, or maybe you're looking at an area within your yard that happens to have some trees. Maybe you're lucky enough to have an oak tree like this one, but you don't necessarily know where to get started in this process. And so, just to get started here, I'm going to go back to this logic model that I've created and think about, what are the first steps that we need to take here? Well, really, the first step is we need to identify our baseline on the site, and then move into identifying our references, assessing stressors, goals, and then executing our management plan, but also monitoring and coming back to assess our progress and reevaluate our situation. And so I'm going to go through each of these steps now in more detail and explain some different tools that might be useful to you all when you're thinking about these steps. So again, a really important part of the restoration process is identifying your baseline. And this might include conducting some different taxonomic surveys. We could do botanical surveys, ornithological, so that's studying birds or insect populations. We might look at the mammals, or if there are stream systems within our forest, we might also do some aquatic surveys. And really, the idea here is to get a sense of what we're starting out with and inventorying that so that we don't accidentally harm something that might be of high quality within our system. If we are doing our insect surveys and we happen to find a really rare moss species, we have to really carefully consider our management practices so that we don't accidentally harm something of high quality, of threatened or endangered species. And depending on your site, this can be a little bit of a daunting task. And so I would say it doesn't have to be, as necessarily extremely comprehensive depending on your goals and your situation. But at least having a baseline inventory of some kind, and then also thinking about how that can be repeatable in the future is really important. So once we have a baseline inventory of a lot of those taxonomic groups, the plants and the insects and the animals, we want to consider what kind of soils are we working with. And so one really important tool that we've discussed previously in some of our other webinars in the series is the web soil survey. And this is a really, really impressive tool that has a multitude of different aspects and data in the report system that shows us our soil classifications and properties, but also, this soil report system gives us a lot of valuable ecological and forestry data. So here's an area that I manage here at the University of Illinois, and that I'm considering implementing some research projects on in the future. And I've just used the web soil survey to pull up my different soil types within this forest patch that I'm going to be working on managing. But I'm not necessarily a soil taxonomist. So having a Dana silt loam with 2 to 5% slopes doesn't necessarily tell me all that much, just because I'm not super knowledgeable with these different soil classifications. However, there are some other, as I mentioned, there are some really valuable aspects of the web soil survey that are built into the system, including these web soil survey reports and ecological descriptions that you can select as different options within the prompts. And so I really encourage you to explore this web soil survey tool and take a look at some of the different information and resources that are within it. So now, like I said, a Dana silt loam doesn't necessarily tell me a whole lot as a restoration ecologist because of my lack of knowledge. But now I have this map which classifies and relates each of these different soil types to a very specific ecological site context, which I can more easily understand. And actually, if you do this, if you pull the web soil survey up yourself and take a look at your different classifications, each of these is a link which you can then click on, and then it will give you a lot more information about ecological history and common plant species and other physical and ecological dynamics of this that relate to this specific soil classification. So a lot of valuable information there regarding the ecology. But even beyond that, there's these forestry reports which have some really useful applications as far as management when we're thinking about restoring a system. They've got different different categories, including potential for seed mortality. So how likely it is that if you put seedlings out on the site, how likely is it that they're going to potentially die because of, maybe the soil has very wet properties, or it's too dry or something, or it just isn't a good match for these specific species. And so we have there's a specific suitability index for walnut, which if you're interested in choosing walnuts, your system is helpful. But there's also these more broad site indices, which is an important um, part of forestry, and it helps us think about these site indices are essentially growth rates of different tree species that might do well or not relative to this soil type. And so um, when I pulled up the site indices for this plot, it gave me ideas of white oak and red oak and various other species and how well they might perform on this site or not because of those soils. So again, looking at the soils, once you've performed your web soil survey, you might also think about performing a lab analysis, because the web soil survey is really kind of broad and gives you a broad picture of what you might be working with in your system, but doesn't necessarily give you the very specific attributes of that soil, and doesn't really describe well the micro environments and differences in um, the smaller site scale that you might need for placing specific plants in certain areas. So I'd also recommend looking at getting a lab analysis, and use a lab that's certified by this Agricultural Laboratory Testing Association. Uh, after we've you know after we've done some research on our soils, we also might consider looking at our specific site history, and so we have some soils data, and then looking back at what had occurred on that landscape historically, which might be again using aerial photography or early written accounts, or even you might find some studies that describe the site or system that you're working in, and then using that in unison with your soils data and your baseline inventory, we can really now identify a very specific reference site that matches hopefully our soil types, and the recommended ecological associations for those soil types. And again, going back to those natural divisions and the area that you're working in, we can now really narrow down a specific site that we want to look at. And I would also recommend, if you have a site in mind, do a web soil survey query on that reference site as well, and see how the soils compare with your potential restoration site. Now that we have a reference site, and we have an assessment of our initial site qualities, we want to assess any stressors that we might have on the site. And these are things that uh, many of you identified earlier in that image. We saw a lot of honeysuckle that was removed, and that also includes other invasive species. Biological stressors with those invasive species, but also diseases or browse pressure. These environmental stressors are basically anything that are forcing our ecosystem into a certain direction or not, that we need to address before we can really begin with the restoration process. So it'd be things like removing those invasive species. If there's tile drainage and we're trying to restore a bottomland forest, we probably need to address that drainage issue. It could also, be again something like heavy shading that's due to shade tolerant species that have grown up and that we might need to address with some mechanical removal. Or you might have problems like herbicide drift. And last week's webinar that we had, which is now available on YouTube, you should definitely check out to if you haven't seen it already, to get an idea of the specific issues we're currently facing in the state with herbicide drift. So once we've assessed our stressors, we then want to establish our goals and objectives. And really, the goals are kind of broad long-term outcomes. So, say For example, we want to restore this native ecosystem. Well, that's not always very helpful, or the goals are not always extremely applicable to what actually happens on the ground. And so we need more specific objectives, which we can measure and then use to gauge our progress towards those goals. And so things like eradicating those or those invasive species, encouraging oak regeneration, and establishing native ground cover might all be part of our objectives. And then those are more specific objectives that we can use to directly inform our on the ground management. Uh, One of the most important aspects, when we're thinking about ecological restoration is that site preparation. And I would say that this site preparation is really addressing those environmental stressors that we just discussed. So it's again getting the site ready to be able to support our future efforts. And those might include things again like invasive species removal, erosion control, and maybe canopy thinning that give us um, kind of a blank slate from which we can work. If you're talking about working in urban systems, maybe in your yard, the site preparation might be a little different. You might not necessarily have like invasive species. Well, you definitely can. I've seen a lot of invasive species within urban systems, but maybe you have a lawn that you're interested in converting to more of a woodland restoration or something. And thinking about how we can convert this lawn is a little bit more precise than we might be doing on a more of a natural area scale. And so we can use different techniques like cultivation, smothering, sod removal, or herbicide to get that sod up and have a clean slate of bare soil from which we can start our restoration process. These are some of the most common invasive species that are present within a lot of our wooded systems and that you might be dealing with um, as you start your restoration process. Things like buckthorn, honeysuckle, and autumn olive are really kind of problematic woody species that are present throughout a huge area within the state. Japanese barberry is a more shade tolerant invasive, and you might find it, in areas that you might not necessarily find things like autumn olive. Um, bittersweet can really choke out a forest. It's a really terrible vine. And then multiflora rose, garlic, mustard, and canary grass are all more herbaceous types of uh, invasive species that can be problematic and may not necessarily uh, be easy to eradicate as a woody species might. They might linger and persist longer term, and you might need multiple rounds. It might just not just be an initial site preparation that you can use to get rid of those. You might need sustained efforts over time to address them. And so um, there's another great webinars from this series that we have posted on YouTube that Chris did a few weeks ago. And I would definitely encourage you to check that out as well. But I just wanted to briefly mention again, some of the invasive species treatments that we have to address some of these different species. Those include things like broadcast applications. Maybe it's mechanical removal with something like a forestry mulcher. But then there are also a lot of individual plant treatments, which might be more applicable for, a small crew or a homeowner who wants to address invasive species on their property. Things like basil bark application, uh, or a combination of herbicide applications and mechanical treatments like injections, girdling, and cut stumps. And again, I'm not covering these very much in depth, but Chris had a great webinar a few weeks ago that he really covered all of these topics in depth. And so, once we have removed our invasive species, we might think about something like a thinning treatment. Um, and this really kind of leverages our silvicultural techniques that we have and incorporates aspects of forest stand improvement that we might be able to potentially get some funding for from things like funding bodies like the NRCS to do things like single tree selection. That's removing single trees to kind of give the other trees more space. Or we might do something like a patch cut, which we use in certain areas to open up a very specific area of a patch and allow more light to that specific area. Again, prescribed fire is really a historic management practice that was really heavily employed by a lot of Native American folks, but is a very important tool in maintaining a lot of our restoration efforts. And it can be helpful for like controlling invasive woody species, for example. It's a really broad topic that I'm not going very much in depth into. And a whole webinar presentation could just be dedicated to a lot of these other topics. But when you're using prescribed fire in woodlands, especially, you need to be cautious, especially because of things like invasive grasses, like Japanese stilt grass. There are certain invasive species that might actually be enforced with fire. Uh, One of the most important aspects of performing your woodland management is incorporating heterogeneity, which is differences in canopy structure. So maybe it's height within the forest, and including a canopy layer of your trees, but also thinking about the mid-story shrubs and trees that are kind of in the middle, and the herbaceous layer that we don't necessarily always think about in other forestry contexts. Um, so there are a lot of native shrubs that you might think about incorporating both on your natural restorations, but also in the home landscape. And Kevin had a awesome webinar I think last year about native shrub species for your home landscape. So I would definitely encourage you to check out that webinar if you have not seen that one already as well. We might think about doing things like tree enrichment plantings, which can include direct seeding of acorns, bare root seedlings, and containerized stock. And depending on which option we decide to pursue for this, it really kind of depends on the scale that we're working at. If we're working on a really large area, maybe that was previously a crop field, like in this image here, we might think about doing direct seeding of acorns. This is an acorn seeder implement on the back of this tractor here, which can cover a large area very quickly for relatively low cost, just the cost of that acorn seed. But if you're working on a home landscape, something like this is not really not necessarily the best option. You might think about using either bare root or probably containerized stock in your planting. And so, being an arborist, I really just wanted to mention this quickly, but there are a lot of important considerations if you're going to use that containerized stock specifically, including digging a hole that's much wider than your root ball, making sure that you have the proper planting height and that your root flare is at that soil surface level, or maybe a little bit just above that soil surface level, then removing all that packaging and or the container, and ensuring that there's no air pockets in that hole. So I just take any opportunity I can to reinforce these basic planting concepts. But we also have a really great webinar series from Ryan Penkow from a few years ago, one of our education extension educators, and he goes through in depth a lot of the different planting techniques from bare root to containerized stock. And so I would definitely recommend that you check that out as well. One of the most important things we can do, which might not always be possible in the context of a natural area, but are definitely a great idea within more of an urban setting, is providing some type of mulch for your trees. That might be an organic hardwood or a leaf litter mulch. And you want to have a 2 to 3 inch layer, but keep that away from the base of the tree. And ideally, you can mulch really as much area around that tree as possible. And this really, especially in an urban context, provides us a good base from which to plant a lot of our other native wildflowers and things, and helps kind of simulate a lot of the woody debris that we might have on the forest floor that has been either picked up and is not necessarily present any longer within the urban setting. Depending on the scale again of your project, you might really want to consider watering if possible, and things like these watering bags, or if you're on a larger scale, you might think of something like an irrigation system. And again, this is not always possible in the context of like a natural area restoration, but can be really important, especially in urban areas where the tree may not necessarily have as much access to water within the soil. You also want to think about protecting your investment. If you're going to go ahead and plant all these trees, you definitely want to add things like tree tubes and cages, even within natural areas, especially to prevent things like reduced browsing pressure. Uh, so another critical aspect, I've been talking a lot about encouraging and incorporating woody material, those canopy trees and shrubs into our restorations, but you really also want to invest a lot of time in thinking about the understory component, the herbaceous component within your restoration. And this is often something that gets neglected, when we're thinking about forest management because, you're kind of literally getting down into the weeds of things. But this herbaceous layer provides a lot of important resources for our pollinators. It provides what we call like a soft landing for a lot of those caterpillars and lepidopterans that are going to be feeding up in our canopy trees, as their caterpillars, but then might fall down and uh, have a different life stage. Maybe when they pupate and become moss, a lot of that happens in the understory layer. They also find habitat to hide within that understory layer over the winter. So it's a really important aspect that we need to think about and dedicate some time to as well. Depending on the scale of your project, a uh, you might have a really heavily designed uh, herbaceous layer. If you're thinking about, doing this in your front yard, for example, you might have very specifically, think about placing where you're going to put each of your plant species. And if you're working on more of a larger scale, you are going to probably use something like a seed mix, and you need to think about, like a stratification period. A lot of our native plants have what's called a cold stratification period that they need, where they need a period of cold to be able to germinate next spring. So if you're using a seed mix, definitely consider the requirements of those specific species that you use. And also be very careful, I'd say, in both your seed mixes and in your designs when incorporating more aggressive species. And so we're running a little short on time, so I'm not going to ask you guys what these are, but I'm sure a lot of you recognize them. These are common native plant species, Virginia wild rye, goldenrod, and white snakeroot that are pretty aggressive and are incorporated into a lot of our restorations. But you can see by the C values here, we've got Canada goldenrod with a 1, and then other, white snakeroot and Virginia wild rye with 2 to 4. They're relatively low C values, meaning that they're pretty non-conservative species. They're very aggressive, and if you're not careful, they might take over within your restored systems. And so, how do we move towards getting more conservative species like these other analogs to those other species? Well, a lot of it has to do with matching, again, avoiding a lot of those aggressive species, and then considering the requirements, and seed viability of some of your species like sedges and spring ephemerals, which we might target to incorporate in our restorations, are sometimes have lower seed viability, and therefore, we have to have special considerations if we want to incorporate those. It might just be easier to use other types of propagules, maybe from a root um, of another plant, to be able to start to use those in our systems instead. We might also have, allelochemicals from invasive species or altered microbial communities. And, these mycorrhizae, these what we call AMF, arbuscular mycorrhizae, are often really important for a lot of those more conservative species, but are not something that we necessarily consider in restorations. So if you're having trouble recruiting a lot of those more conservative species within your restorations, I definitely recommend doing a little bit of research on AMF and how you might be able to incorporate them by using things like soil samples from soil propagules from higher quality sites and incorporating those into your site might help you retain some of those higher, more conservative species. Don't underestimate weed pressure within your systems as well. And, you know, we we need to monitor for weeds using like a more of an integrated pest management approach, but then be pretty aggressive when you're using your mowing, cultivation, um, and some of the other techniques that we already discussed to make sure that these weeds do not take over. And These could be, invasive species that are recruiting back into your system. Things like garlic mustard, like I mentioned before, you might need a long-term monitoring and um, network of people to help remove that long term. It's not just a one and done type of a thing. Again, is the monitoring component of restoration is really critical, and it helps us track, our progress over time. So we have that initial inventory that I described earlier, and in addition to that, we want to have a repeatable and objective system to be able to monitor moving forward. And it might be something that you do on a yearly basis, or depending on the scale of your project, maybe it's a few years in between your monitoring efforts, or maybe if it's a smaller scale system, you do multiple sessions per year. But if you're thinking about how to develop your restoration and monitoring protocols, I would definitely, again, check out the Critical Trends Assessment Program and uh, the National Ecological Observatory Network, which have several protocols which you might be able to use for things like vegetation sampling and bird sampling to get an idea of how you might implement a restoration monitoring program within your site. And so looping back to these images that we looked at in the beginning of the presentation, um, you know, we kind of come back and think about now these in the context of some of the things we've discussed. And so assessing your goals and this idea of an iterative process of restoration, um, how can we evaluate the work we've completed and the timeline that we've done it in? But also, what are the changes within the ecosystem overall? We can definitely kind of infer that there are some changes in like the C values and floristic quality within both of these systems, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily restored, and we need to come back and assess our progress and then update based on, we're definitely in a better place now, but how can we continue to adapt our management um, to have to address our future restoration goals and objectives. And so I know I'm a little bit short on time here, but I appreciate you guys hanging in with me. Here are some of the key points of this presentation. Restoration again is an iterative process. It's possible on any landscape, no matter the size, but it's definitely scale and context dependent. So depending on, if you're working at home or if you're in a wooded area, you're going to be using, the concepts are the same, but you might be using different types of management techniques. Um, Heterogeneity is, again, really important, and I would encourage everyone, no matter what scale you're working on, to incorporate some of that heterogeneity into your system, by using different levels of the canopy, as well as incorporating different species. And then be sure to support your understory mid-story. Um, don't underestimate the weeds, and be sure to monitor your progress moving forward. Um, Here are some professional resources that you can refer to if you need additional help with your specific project. And we will share these slides. So yeah, again, we'll have these slides, so I definitely recommend that you check out all of these resources if you want to learn more.